And here we are. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Slavery Archive Book Club. We are very pleased to have with us today dear Marcus Rediker, historian that you know him for very long, I am sure. And today we are here to discuss his new book, then Freedom Ship, that was just published with Viking Penguin in the United States. Then, of course, this is not Marcus' first book. So, and of course, when I will be introducing Marcus, I would just remind you about some of his most important books. And this is a historian that we can introduce him in so many ways. So I first I invite you also to look at his website and to follow him on social media as well, on X, not on X, but on Blue Sky, and also on Facebook, from where you can also learn more about his work. So let me introduce Marcus. And this introduction will not be as generous as it should be, but because it would be very long, but let's go. So Marcus Rediker is a distinguished professor of Atlantic history at the University of Pittsburgh. He's a historian who has been writing then histories from below. And one, I would say, of his most well-known books is The Slave Ship, A Human History, a book that has inspired all of us who write about the history of this human atrocity that is the Atlantic slave trade and slavery. And this is a book that has also been translated and in multiple languages. And I don't know how many languages, but then in many, many languages. And have won a book also that has won several, numerous awards, including then the George Washington Book Prize. And also that indeed it has been translated into 19 languages, I think that perhaps even 20 now. Also, Marcus is engaged then in making these histories that he has been writing then for many years accessible to large audiences. And this is then in tune with what you have been doing here at the Slaveryarchive Book Club, especially in these days that we are living now. Then he has produced a film that is titled Ghosts of Amistad, with director Tony Buba. Several of us we have been using this movie in the classroom, and you can find it for free on YouTube. He also wrote a play that is The Return of Benjamin Lay, and this is based on the book that has the same title. So the book that we are discussing today is Freedom Ship, The Uncharted History of Escaping Slavery by Sea. And this was published then in May 2025. And if you want to see other important books that Marcus published, please go to his website and explore these other works. Thank you so much, Marcus. It's really an honor for us to have you with us today, and welcome. So now I will share my screen with the presentation, and just let me know when I have to move to the next slide.
Right. Okay. Anna, thank you very much. Alex, thank you. I admire the work that you do in Slaveryarchive. I think you've done a tremendous job of really helping to internationalize the discussion. So I want to thank you very much for that. I'm going to jump straight to the main conclusion of Freedom Ship and tell you that one of the arguments of the book is that it estimates that 15 to 20,000 people emancipated themselves over 3 decades, roughly 1829 to 1861. They emancipated themselves by escaping by sea, one way or another. There were several routes. Now, these brave people, one by one, expanded the living conception of freedom, and they also helped to bring on the Civil War and general emancipation. There is a collective power to what they did. and yet we know very little about them. I would like to mention three books that I think are very important. One is David Siselsky's The Waterman's Song. Cassandra Newby Alexander has written an important book on escaping slavery using the waterways of Virginia. And Tim Walker has edited a very good collection of essays called Sailing to Freedom for people who might like to look at other works. But these people who escaped, they exercised what Frederick Douglass called invisible agency. And for this talk, what I want to explore is the relationship, a kind of classical issue for historians, the relationship between structure and agency. Kind of a theoretical question, but one that I think we might want to think about. I'm of the opinion that the term agency is overused and somewhat abused in these times. It's a very powerful concept, but I have a quite specific understanding of it. So let's talk about structure and agency. And if we could have the next slide, please, Anna. Okay, this is one of the best images I have ever seen of a port city. This is in New York. These are the Hudson River docks in the 1860s. And what I want to convey with the use of this image is what an extraordinary workplace a port city was, the waterfront. Look at the tremendous variety of workers. You can see sailors, you can see dock workers, you can see market women, draymen, cartmen, you name it. And what I also want to emphasize is that just imagine from the point of view of merchant capitalists who are organizing this trade, how difficult it would be to police a space like this. Okay, I think that comes across, I think, very well in this image. Now, there are several main players in my study. And if we could have the next image, please. First of all, sailors, mostly black sailors, but there were white sailors involved too. On your left, you'll see Frederick Douglass, who is dressed as a sailor, as in fact he did actually dress when he made his escape from slavery in Baltimore in 1838. But the key point is that sailors occupied this very strategic position in the division of labor, which meant that they are sailing into southern ports on thousands of ships year after year, and they are the ones who can make a direct connection with enslaved people working on the waterfront in southern port cities. Okay, but they're not the only ones. Another important player in this is the market woman. And you'll see on the right, a market woman is painted by Thomas Waterman Wood in Baltimore. This is a Baltimore woman. You can see she's selling fresh vegetables. These market women worked the waterfront and they actually went on board the ships. And frequently when they were on board the ships, they would find a trustworthy sailor and say, "Do you have a stowaway?" And then later that night, there would be an armed rescue party sent to the vessel to help that person escape. Okay, and the next slide. These are dock workers of Charleston, South Carolina. These were drawn by a British artist named Eyre Crowe in 1853. Dock workers are also really crucial figures in this story because they're the ones who unload the ships and then reload the ships. And what you need to know is that in both southern and northern port cities, many, if not most, of the dock workers were Black. Okay, that they were, again, in a position to know how to get somebody on board a ship. The man at the lower right wearing the hat, actually what Eyre Crowe has written, he says, "I be on the deck all the time. I didn't hear nothing." It's almost as if someone was asking him about a runaway. or a sail away or an escapee. Okay, so that I think is very important. And the next slide. Okay, I want to talk to you now about the issue of structure. Okay, because the agency that these many thousands of people exercised could not have been possible without a deep structure of trading patterns in the 19th century. Now, I want to begin with port cities. And the port cities that I've studied, Atlantic port cities, they are beginning in the South, Savannah, Charleston, Wilmington, North Carolina, Norfolk, Virginia, Baltimore, Maryland. Those are the ports of exit for maritime escapees. And then there's Philadelphia, New York, New Bedford, and Boston. These are the ports of arrival. These kinds of Atlantic port cities played an essential role within the larger system of Atlantic capitalism in this time period. As I'm sure all of you know, these port cities are the primary nodes of social, cultural, political, and economic power. These are the places from which world trade is organized. These are the places that make the world market possible. Commodities will flow into these port cities from their hinterlands, let's say in southern ports. And once they get there, a group of waterfront workers, multiracial, multi-ethnic, will load those commodities onto the ships that are northbound in almost all cases. I call that group of workers the motley crew. They move hogsheads of tobacco. They move barrels of rice. They move bales of cotton. They load and unload the ship. Their cooperation is organized by the merchant capitalists. They drive the national economy and they drive the world economy. But, and this I think is really a crucial point, but once their cooperation has been organized, they then begin to develop among themselves other projects. Okay. So one of the projects that they organize is moving not only commodities by sea into the world market, but basically moving people to freedom by the very same means. Okay. Now, thousands of ships sailed into southern ports every year. 80% of them were owned by northern merchants. Many of these vessels were what were called packet ships, which meant that they sailed from these northern ports to the southern ports on a regular and predictable basis. They returned to the same port, often with the same crew, year after year. And to give you a sense of the magnitude, in 1842 alone, 1,700 ships sailed into Charleston, the vast majority of them to go back to northern ports, some percentage of them to go to Great Britain, but most of them actually go to New York. That's another important thing to remember. So someone named Ben Schmidt, working with a collection of ship captains' logbooks, created the image that you're looking at right now, in which every single thin black line represents one voyage. And what I would call your attention to is the thick black area up and down the coast of Eastern North America. Okay? Every single one of these lines represents a potential line of escape. Okay? I'd also ask you to notice that in the North Atlantic, there's another very thick line that goes from New York to Liverpool. And that is those are the cotton ships. Those are the ships that are carrying the cotton that are used in Great Britain on the cutting edge of the Industrial Revolution to create textiles, which are in many ways the primary commodity of the Industrial Revolution. Some of these will be used in the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. So here's my main point in showing you this image and talking about these Atlantic port cities. The structure of trade is essentially identical to the structure of escape. In other words, every time a ship comes into a southern port, it will leave and it can potentially carry one or more people to that northern port to freedom. Now, Southern elites did everything they could to try to separate out the very profitable patterns of trade from this subversive network of escape. And they did all kinds of things. They passed these Negro Seaman Acts, for example, in which they tried to quarantine Black sailors when they first came into the port, keep them from interacting with enslaved people on the docks. That didn't work. They also tried fumigating the vessels, literally setting sulfur afire on the lower deck of the ship to try to smoke out people who were hiding somewhere. They tried ship inspection acts, a very big one in Virginia in 1856. But the problem is the number of ships was just overwhelming. There were thousands and thousands of these ships and too few inspectors. So none of these efforts to police the waterfront and prevent these maritime escapees from getting on board these vessels, none of them worked. Okay? None of them worked. So that's very important. Okay, so I talk a lot about the structure of escape, but I also talk about the art of escape. And I'd like to turn to that now. If we could have the next slide, please. My argument is that escaping slavery, not only in the 19th century, but basically anytime, anywhere, was as much an intellectual feat as a physical one. In other words, you had to think your way to freedom. I found one serial runaway whose language I liked. He had a concept for this. He said, escape requires head work. You've got to have strategy. You've got to have planning. You've got to have certain kinds of knowledge. Okay, so what kinds of knowledge would you need to make an escape that would very likely be successful? You need geographical knowledge, first of all. What is the terrain? What are the distances? You need natural knowledge. What is the best season for escape, for example? How can I feed myself along the way? You need economic knowledge. What's the pattern of shipping? When do the ships arrive? What season? What's the best time to try to get away from the point of view of finding a safe ship? And then there's social knowledge, which may be the most crucial of all. You needed to be able to figure out who you could trust. You needed to be able to answer the question, who can help me? Who is likely to help me? Who can harm me? Right? The people who were consistently crucial to these escapes were the free Black communities, North and South. They would shelter and feed escapees for long periods of time until they could find a safe ship. And then the free Black communities in the northern ports, which were quite sizable by the 19th century, most of those people lived near the waterfront and worked on the waterfront. So they were in a very good position to know who was coming in on these ships. Okay. Now, there are also abolitionist organizations that are formed in the 1830s, which are going to be crucial to helping these escapees. I'm going to say more about that in a moment. But notice the point here. We kind of have this implicit assumption that escaping slavery was an individual act. You could try to do it that way, but your likelihood of failure was extremely great. Escaping was a social act, a collective act. You needed help. And here, let me circle back to that point I made about the packet ships coming, often with the same crew, again and again to the same port. That allowed people working on the docks in the southern ports to form relationships of trust with these sailors who were coming into port. That could be very important to making a decision to go for it, to try to sail away. So this is a social and collective process. I want to illustrate this by telling you the story of a really remarkable man named Moses Roper. We see a picture of him right here. Moses Roper was an enslaved person. He lived in several different parts of the South, in North Carolina and in Florida. He was probably the most determined person to be free that I have ever come across. At the age of 13, he ran away for the first time. And over the next 6 years, he would run away. I think the number was 19 more times. And every time he did, he would be tortured in response by his slavers. What this man went through is almost impossible to believe. They would do things to him like smash his fingernails, set his hair on fire, cover it with tar and set it on fire, encumber him with every kind of heavy iron they could imagine. They had 20-pound weights on both feet at one point. And one man in particular, an enslaver named John Gooch, he tormented Moses for a number of years. And at one point, Moses wrote in this memoir of his life, he said, the stock of his cruelties finally seemed to be exhausted. In other words, he couldn't think of anything else to do to this man to try to prevent him from running away. And the truth is that the will of Moses Roper to be free was stronger than all of the tortures the enslavers could design. So he begins in Florida. He's working on the Apalachicola River. He begins a 350-mile trek by land. Along the way, he uses his knowledge of the commons to feed himself. He makes strategic connections to people who can help him. He finally arrives in Savannah, Georgia, and he goes directly to the docks and he starts asking for a job working as a steward, meaning the person who prepared food for the crew. Now, this is a feature common to successful escapees. He had experience in this kind of work because he had been a steward on a steamship that sailed up and down the Apalachicola River. So he found a ship that he could sail out on. He made his way to New York, which is where most of these ships actually went. When he got to New York, he discovered, just like Frederick Douglass did, that the place was crawling with slave catchers. So he went up the Hudson River to Albany. He went over land through New Hampshire and Vermont. He ended up in Boston. He was going to stay in Boston, but then a couple of very likely fellow sailors told him that there was a slave hunter after him in Boston. So he took another ship on to Liverpool. So remember that dark line of ships from New York and Boston to Liverpool. He ended up there in the UK in 1836, I think it was. He immediately wrote his life story. He joined the abolitionist movement. And over the next 20 years or so, he gave about 2,000 lectures. And he always included in this lecture how he escaped by sea. It was a powerful and thrilling story to anyone who saw it. Okay, so within the structure of trade, a fugitive like Moses Roper, with the help of a lot of different people, exercises agency, makes his way to New York. And by the way, hundreds of other people are arriving in these northern ports at the same time. And that then creates a new structural innovation. If we could have the next slide, please, Anna. In 1835, about a year after Moses Roper arrived in New York, a Black sailor abolitionist by the name of David Ruggles, you see him pictured here in a white top hat to the left, forms a new kind of abolitionist organization called the Vigilance Committee, the New York Committee of Vigilance. This is a Black-led group, and they have two primary reasons for forming. The first is to prevent the theft, literally, or what they call the blackbirding of free Black workers in New York who sometimes would be jumped by a gang of ruffians and thrown on board a ship, taken to the South, and sold into slavery. This was a very frequent occurrence in New York. So this was one of the main reasons that the Vigilance Committee was formed, to be vigilant on the waterfront, to protect people. But the other main reason was that these many people from the South were showing up, and there was no infrastructure to help them. So David Ruggles, who was a man who knew the waterfront like the back of his hand, he knew all the black dock workers, he knew the sailors, he literally would engage in street fights to protect people from being blackbirded. He helps to build this organization, and then very rapidly thereafter, Philadelphia and Boston both form vigilance committees. Again, with a kind of strong leadership role of the free black community. And now, when people began to arrive in New York, there is an organization in place to help them. It's a more radical organization than the Garrisonian American Anti-Slavery Society chapters. They do believe in armed self-defense. This is very important to know. And Frederick Douglass himself will be a beneficiary of this, because when he arrives in New York in 1838, he didn't know what to do, where to go. He was depressed. He was homesick. He meets a former sailor he knew in Maryland, who told him that there is this thing called the Vigilance Committee. And the next day, another black sailor takes him to David Ruggles. David Ruggles protects him. Anna Murray, the wife-to-be of Frederick Douglass, comes to New York. And then, as I'm sure many of you know, they go on to New Bedford, primarily because Frederick was a skilled caulker on the Baltimore waterfront. But I want you to notice here this fascinating way in which self-activity or agency from below creates a situation in which new organizations and new institutions, new structures are formed. So there's an interesting dynamic between structure, agency, more structure, more agency. These things are very closely linked. Okay, so if we can have the final image, please. Okay. One of the arguments of this book is that this image, which I'm sure everybody knows, this was the image that appeared in a lot of advertisements for runaways, escapees in Southern newspapers. There was a female version of this too. This image is misleading, because what it makes you think is that twofold: escapes happened on land and they happened individually. Not true in either case. So this very important image in popular culture misleads us. Another thing that misleads us is the very title of the system of resistance called the Underground Railroad. Folks, I have to tell you, people didn't escape underground, and very few of them escaped on railroads. So, but what's fascinating is that that's a metaphor, right? A metaphor organizes your understanding by focusing on certain things, but it also occludes other things from your vision. And this, I think, is one of the reasons why, despite the outstanding scholarship on people's escapes from slavery, over 100 years of good scholarship, we couldn't see these maritime people. And then there's one more reason. And this, I think, might be the most important one. I spent my whole life trying to convince people that history happens at sea. Many people have been disinclined to believe me. And for many years, I kept trying to think of some way of describing the blindness that people have to things that happen at sea. And I finally, half humorously, invented a word called terracentrism. What that means is land-centered. Our history is land-centered. We think history happens on land in nation states. But the corollary and the kind of uninspected flip side of that is that somehow the seas and oceans of the world are ahistorical voids where history doesn't happen. Now, there are a couple of fields, so to speak. There's another landed metaphor that in which you obviously know that history does happen at sea, the history of exploration and naval history. But national histories, for the most part, are landed. And so I think this also has prevented us from seeing the kinds of things. I mean, my argument is that class formation happens at sea, race formation happens at sea, the history of capitalism happens at sea. You've got to have the sea even to understand the most basic things, the most basic causes of the historical process. Okay, so why does it all matter? Helps us to see running away in a new light. It's not individualistic, it's social, it's collective. It depends on lateral connections within the waterfront working class. It's not vertical like manumission, it's horizontal. It depends on solidarity. And then a second thing, which I think is crucial, is that, folks, this is abolitionism from below, right? This is abolitionism in which the actions taken by people to free themselves help to determine the future course of the abolitionist movement. You know, we're taught for many years that abolition was just a movement of educated, middle class, and upper class gentlemen like Lewis Tappan and William Wilberforce. But now we know that resistance and action from below is really critical to the history of abolition and the struggle against slavery, which did happen at sea. Okay, thank you. And we can X out, Anna, of the PowerPoint. We can't hear you.
Thank you, dear Marcus. This is wonderful, and I am sure that you are going to have a lot of questions. Of course, some people here, they didn't read the book necessarily, but then this was also a great opportunity then to start and to lead to the book. So if you have any questions, and Alex can help as well with that, like if you have questions, please, you can raise your hand. Also, you can put your question in the chat, but we always prefer that you show you then that you speak on video, because this is being live streamed. Then people see who you are and can listen to your voice. Any questions? Okay.
I am sorry, but I'm not finding the hand raising. Karin,
okay.
I did put my question in the chat. It's because Professor Rediker talked about, the slave that escaped through the road, that it was less than what, I ever thought. I thought it was, the story of Harriet Tubman, where they say she was coming back and forth and liberate some of the people that were still in the South. I was under the impression, like many people, that there were more people escaping through the land. And I am a bit surprised. So what part of fictional Harriet Tubman's story is, and which part is actual, factual?
Yeah, good question, Celine. It is true that Harriet Tubman organized numerous escapes by land. She did this. I read quite a bit about these escapes. And one of the things I say in my book is that she referred to these escapes as reversing the Middle Passage. It's kind of fascinating that you escape slavery. But as a person from Maryland, like Fredericks Douglass, she was also involved in maritime escapes. In fact, she helped her sister and her husband to get a vessel that would assist people to escape. I would say probably, we don't really know how many people escaped slavery, either by land or by sea. There have been estimates of as few as 50,000, as many as 100,000 total. I suspect probably a majority did escape by land in places like Missouri and Kentucky that were very close to northern states. Now, that too was kind of maritime because people had to cross rivers, right? There weren't very many bridges in this day. You had to go by ferry, you had to swim, you had to get someone to carry you in a small boat. So almost all escapes had some maritime element. But we do know for a fact that in places like Virginia and Maryland, most of the people got away by sea. And that's because of Chesapeake Bay, which was it's 4,400 square miles of water with inlets and creeks and a complicated river system. You just couldn't police it and you couldn't control it. And then here's my other point. This Atlantic system of escape is important because it involves the major port cities, which are the centers for media. In the North, they're also the centers of abolitionism. So there are people escaping by water all over the place. You know, I began this project thinking that I would study maritime escapes everywhere, but it turns out there are 5 different systems. There is a Caribbean system. There is, because of trading patterns from the South to Jamaica, Barbados, places like that, there is a Gulf of Mexico system. And I do mean Gulf of Mexico. There is a Mississippi River system. There is a Great Lakes system, which becomes especially important after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850. So what I'm describing just along the Atlantic coast is itself only a part of a much larger system of maritime escape. But we haven't done the research yet to know what their proportions likely are. And there are ways in which we may never know, because the perfect escape was one that left no documentation. So we may never know exactly how many people escaped. But I can tell you 15 to 20,000 is a large percentage of the total.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have now another question from Emmanuel. Emmanuel, I will add you to the spotlight, and Celine, I will remove you. Let's go. Go ahead, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think I read your books for my comms last semester, and I kind of enjoyed them. And I think what is interesting for me is your conversation about agency, and I use the term invisible agency. I was wondering if you could speak more about that and let us understand. The second question has to do with the Black Deckers who were working. I want to find out where they paid laborers or they were just working as slaves.
Okay. Yeah, invisible agency is a term that Frederick Douglass used, and it's also a term that the great Black abolitionist William Still, who was based in Philadelphia, he used the same term. Now, William Still was an agent for the Vigilance Committee, and he interviewed almost all of the people who arrived in Philadelphia and were looking for help, for shelter, for food, for clothing, for a job. He interviewed over 900 people. It's a remarkable body of evidence if anyone wants to read it. William Still is the author. I think what they meant by invisible agency was that the acts of subversion that a lot of people are taking are subtle and unknown. And there's actually a double meaning to that, okay? It is not true that what the thousands of people who escaped from southern ports, what they did was not invisible to southern enslavers. They understood very well that they were losing human labor, and they did everything they could to try to prevent it. But the invisible agency of it is that people didn't really, in the North, for example, outside the abolitionist movement, didn't really understand this maritime network. And even more revealingly for me, people in the present haven't been able to see it. In other words, it's remarkable that we've had these hundreds and hundreds of books on the Underground Railroad, and many of them don't say anything about the sea at all. So that agency has been invisible to historians beginning from in the 1890s, lasting up to the present. So I think part of what I wanted to show was that it's almost like a machine. It's just constantly driving. It's creating friction. Its power doesn't lie in any individual escape. Its power lies in the collective power of this happening over and over and over again. And of course, that will also make a huge difference in terms of friction between northern and southern states. And let me give you an example. In 1839, 3 black sailors in Virginia help an enslaved man named Isaac escape back to New York. Well, it turns out his enslaver knew what ship he was on. He went to New York, he captured him, but the governor of Virginia wanted the governor of New York to send those 3 black sailors back to be tried for slave stealing, which is, you can imagine, the South is a very serious crime. William Sewell, the governor of New York, just point blank refused. He said, these people haven't broken any law in the state of New York. So there's this fascinating way in which these steady escapes affect not only the abolition movement, they affect the polarization that is going to lead eventually to civil war. And I chart this quite carefully in the book.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marcus. And I think that we have some, perhaps, Alex, let's take some from the chat. You have better eyes than me to look at the chat.
We have none from the chat yet. I encourage people to, if they're not able to join us on video, to put their questions on the chat. So we can probably pass on the pin to Elizabeth Davis.
Okay, go ahead.
Wanted to make sure I was not still muted. There we go.
No, you are fine.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Hello, dear Marcus.
How are you?
My fellow Kentuckian. I need to just ask, I live in Ohio. I live in central Ohio, and you know, the street that we know as High Street actually goes through campus, right? Through the Ohio State University campus, but it crosses the whole state of Ohio.
Mm.
And as you know, we're all taught that that it played a kind of crucial role in the Underground Railroad. And so, you know, just maybe because of where I am, I take particular interest in this kind of thing.
Sure.
I also have crossed the river, the Ohio River, many, many times
Mm-hmm.
in a car. And I can tell you that I myself would not want to try doing that at night in particular. I mean, it's a big river.
Yeah.
And so I guess my question is there to what extent is it possible, do you think, to either kind of change the model altogether so that maritime, you know, efforts to reach the sea are privileged in some way in escapes,
Mm-hmm.
versus doing some kind of situation that it sounds like Harriet Tubman already was doing,
Mm-hmm.
where there's a kind of hybridity in
Mm-hmm.
using overland and sea-bound methods. Just your thoughts, because I can see that this is a real, you know, this goes back to it. It's kind of like trying to dislodge an old model, if you will. And
yes, it is absolutely true that people would use different methods of escape in different legs of the journey. I mean, Frederick Douglass went on a train, then he went on a ferry, then he went on a coach, then he went on a steamship. Right? You've gotta see what your best options are. But I guess and I think you too, we're just shocked by the invisibility of the maritime. And part of that, and this goes back to why we call it the Underground Railroad. If you were to look at the amount of freight, commodities, trade carried by land, by railroads or any other means in this, 30-year period before the Civil War, and compare that to the amount of trade carried by sea, it would be vastly, vastly greater, on the order of 50 to 100 times as much. because the road system wasn't well developed in the 19th century. If you had to get something from one place to another, you tried to use a river if you could, right? So part of it is just recovering the sheer material reality of what life was like in that time and understanding that the maritime was much more important to it than people realized. Now, I would go so far as to say that the maritime is much more important to us today than we realize. But again, it's invisible. I think about 80% of the things that are imported into the United States travel by sea in these big containerized cargo vessels. And yet people don't see that. They don't think about that. There's a wonderful book on this subject by an outstanding scholar and writer named Alan Sekula. It's called Fish Story. And he examines this issue of why the seas are these forgotten spaces. But I think this is a battle that has to be fought out. But I think, Elizabeth, that we are winning. And here's why. The national histories are in decline. They don't make that much sense anymore. So when you start talking about Atlantic history and oceanic history and world history, suddenly the seas of the world matter a great deal more. I think a lot of people are still stuck in this kind of terracentric model of thinking about history. But if you're going to do transnational history, the seas have got to be part of it. So that's what gives me hope.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Marcus. We have then two hands here. Monica, let me add Monica. Good to see you.
Hi, good to see you too. Thank you for your presentation today. One thing I was thinking about like the maritime world is also shipwrecks. And I was just thinking about, like, I'm a Latin Americanist, so I started thinking about the Garifuna and even like Esmeraldas, Ecuador, where there are these maroon populations that grew after slave ships wrecked.
Sure.
And so I'm just wondering if you have any other examples or have seen any evidence of this happening, that there were not even necessarily slave ships, but just shipwrecks, and maybe people out of that becoming free or negotiating spaces of freedom through those processes.
Oh, this is something that I wrote about years ago in a book called The Many-Headed Hydra.
Okay.
There are, and here's, that book talks about maroon communities quite a lot, but it also argues that pirate ships, for example, were floating maroon communities. And a very large percentage of the people on pirate ships were people of African descent, because they would escape the plantation system one way or another, get on board the ship, and they were willing to fight like hell to prevent their return to that plantation system. So this is a really interesting question about the way in which people find and create free spaces. Spaces. Now, the port cities are constantly, there's a battle going on about who's going to control that space. Will it be the free Black communities? Will it be the police? The police forces, the first police forces formed in the United States are formed in the port cities for precisely these reasons. Will the slave catchers control it? My friend Steve Hahn has actually written a very interesting argument that urban free Black communities are in many ways maroon communities, because they are these islands seeking autonomy in the context of a very pro-slavery larger national system. So I think in my work as a whole, I've always tried to emphasize the struggle to find these autonomous spaces of freedom. And in this case, those spaces are places on the waterfront. There are a lot of what they call tippling houses and dancing cellars, where Black and white workers from the waterfront would meet and have merriment, sing and dance and all the rest. Those are places where these kinds of deals, you might say, are formed. I'll get you on board that ship. These are places where polite society has no presence. So there are places like the docks. The workplaces themselves, the docks and the ships are relatively autonomous. You can talk to people. You can meet people. You can learn to trust people. And then once you actually sail away out of a southern port, you know, your likelihood of ever being returned to slavery was extremely small, right? If you're going by land, every white person is deputized to stop a Black person on any suspicion whatsoever. You can be arrested by anybody. But once you're on that ship, especially if the captain consents, they didn't often do that. People were smuggled on board, even though the captains didn't know. You're safe until you get to New York or Philadelphia or wherever it is, and slavery has already been abolished in those places. So your likelihood of getting away is so much greater. So I would answer your question by saying that these spaces, these kind of contested spaces, are really a major part of the freedom struggle. The landed spaces in the port city and the maritime spaces on board the ships. Those are spaces of freedom.
Thank you. You're helping my arguments that I'm making my own research.
Oh, good.
Thank you very much.
Oh, good. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you, Monica. And now you have Alex.
Hi, Alex.
I almost want to pass it to, there were two hands after mine, but I feel
it's fine. You
taking
have the right as a host. You can ask your question. I have to, but I will leave my place. Go ahead.
So, Marcus, I'm thinking about, you know, the place where we write history, and you mentioned 5 strands, right? Of all the strands, before the research arrives, I would say probably the one that has the most intersection with the strand that you explore in this book is the Caribbean one. And in the Caribbean, the sea is no surprise. So, for example, I'm thinking here of Julius Scott, The Common Wind, which is, you know, period a little bit before yours, but already maps this kind of vast ocean spaces for us as spaces of freedom, spaces of communication. And of course, Scott led his own revolution with the students before even the book was published that have all pursued this. I hear Laurent Dubois, who's I get to see next week. He's working on a book on 5 rivers, which I think almost map with the 5 with the 5 areas that you described. So the question is, in what ways does Julius Scott world in your mind intersect with yours? I'm sure you're familiar with the text, and
because of him.
Yeah, I figured. So,
yeah, okay, sure. That's a good question, Alex. And yeah, Julius Scott was a dear friend of mine, and I'm proud to be able to tell you that I was the person who arranged for the publication of his dissertation. I was meeting in Paris with Sebastian Budgen of Verso Books, and he said, "What should Verso be publishing?" I said, "You should be publishing a book called The Common Wind." And they did. And the book won 3 major prizes. And this happened before Julius passed away. I would tell everybody that if you go onto YouTube, you can find a wonderful event that we held at the University of Pittsburgh with Robin Kelly and Peter Linebaugh commenting on The Common Wind, and Julius himself commenting on it. So Julius has been my shipmate for a long time. We were in graduate school at roughly the same time. I finished a few years before he did. We've been in touch about very similar sorts of things. And from my first book and his first book, we arrived more or less independently at the idea that mobile people, especially sailors, are vectors of information, vectors of knowledge, vectors of experience, and vectors of subversion. So there's probably no single book that I feel closer to than the common wind. And it definitely informs freedom ship. The common wind is mentioned numerous times. And I'll just give you one example. One of the chapters of that book is about a man named William P. Powell, another Black sailor abolitionist, who runs a boarding house for what he calls colored sailors in New York City. The common wind roars through that boarding house. That's where sailors come and make plans to go liberate somebody from this port or that. The people who have done that bring them back to the boarding house, where he gives them clothes, food, all for no price. This is a kind of simple communism. So I am profoundly indebted to Julia Scott, and I think The Common Wind is one of the great books of our times. Oh, and I also should say, speaking of the Caribbean, you're absolutely right. Neville Hall wrote this classical article in 1985 on maritime marinage. He understood inter-island movement and the importance of the seas to struggle. So I don't think people in the Caribbean have the same, shall we say, illusions as a lot of people in European and American nation states. The very nature of the Caribbean means that water is part of your thinking.
Thank you. And now we have Matthew. I will add you to the spotlight. You can go ahead, please.
Okay, hello there. Thank you so much for the presentation. And I really appreciated one of your comments that, if you're going to do transnational history, the seas have to be a part of it. And I suppose my question is, if you have any further thoughts on the relationship between transnational history as a field and maritime history. And I want to keep thinking through this impossibility of doing Atlantic or transnational history without the maritime world. I did my PhD at Stanford, where we have this track called Transnational, International, and Global History, TIG, where you're required to do two different regions, have two different advisors. And so I did Latin American history and US history. Yeah. And I found that your theory was true by the end of my PhD. I basically became a maritime historian in order to answer the questions I had about the Caribbean, but also through the Atlantic world. And so I suppose, the question is just, is kind of thinking through this impossibility, and what does that mean for us as historians, as scholars, for how we teach transnational history? How do we maybe articulate the expectations for students about what it means to do transnational history as maritime history? What does that look like for the field going forward?
Thank you, Matthew. There is still a lot of transnational history in which, I don't even really like the word transnational, because the root word is still national. And what that frequently means is that people will take certain characteristics of different national experiences and then compare them and connect them, but all within an idiom of very high abstraction. Emmanuel Wallerstein's world system, which has actually been very useful to me. I mean, it really helped me to think. The human subjects are dissolved into the system. That's part of the abstraction. So, depending on how you conceptualize history, I mean, I believe that real history is about real people making real decisions in real time, right? Doesn't mean that there aren't abstractions or structures constraining or guiding their actions. I mean, probably no one who escaped from slavery knew exactly how this Atlantic structure of maritime trade actually worked. But they did know that ships arrived from here and arrived from there and were going back. So they had a kind of partial and very useful knowledge. So I guess I would insist on not dissolving those human subjects into the system and to make the connections real. How does it happen that you go back to Julia Scott? How does it happen that the news of the Haitian Revolution spreads around the Caribbean and around the Atlantic? It's sailors who take the information. They're carriers of this knowledge. So once we get to that level of specificity and concreteness, I think the history just looks different. It looks different. I I do not wish to argue that you don't need structural analysis, but I do argue that the structural analysis needs to be embedded in human history. That was the subtitle of my book, The Slave Ship, A Human History. The abstraction defeats us. It compromises our purposes. In the case of studying the slave trade, abstraction sanitized the history. That we looked at numbers. I mean, how long was the Middle Passage? What was the mortality rate? To say that the mortality rate on a vessel is 18% is completely different from watching 1 out of 5 people die and be thrown over the rails to sharks, their bodies, to sharks that followed the vessels. You know, in my view, we need this concrete understanding in order to see how oppression works and also to see how resistance works. And in that book, you know, the most extraordinary thing, discovery for me, was the way people found ways to fight back under the most extreme circumstances. You know, I've said that the slave trade was in many ways a 400-year hunger strike. There weren't, and the insurrections, the uprisings were much more common than we thought, and we're learning more and more about this all the time. So I make a pitch for history from below, which sees ordinary working people not just as subjects of history, but as makers of history. We need to understand their consciousness. We need to understand the material conditions of their lives. We need to capture their voices whenever we can. And I think that just makes for better history, more deeply human history. That's what I've always tried to do.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Marcus. We now have another question from Laura. I will add her to the spotlight. Welcome, Laura.
Hi, thank you. I'm almost reluctant to ask my question because that was such a beautiful communication that you just gave us about what your intentions are to teach us about history and how to see it. And I thank you for all of that work. So, but since Anna said I should ask the question, I will. So, you talked about the phrase Underground Railroad as being deceptive, and mostly you talked about that it's not underground. But I'd like to ask about the term railroad, actually, because I've always felt sort of moved by the effort to create the Erie Canal and the canal system in the north of New York, which within 20 years, as give or take, of its opening is basically obsolete, as I understand it. And that's in part, large part, because railroad transportation begins to take over. And I have been struck in my reading by the number of Southern investors in railroads pre and post Civil War. And it strikes me that, unlike a ship, a railroad is policeable. So I just wonder if the rail transportation of commerce, which then comes about very assertively after the Civil War, is not the thing that was invented in the sense to police the freedom of the seas by imagining trade otherwise and as policeable. And I have done some work on the history of migrant labor to California in the Depression. And I mean, the trains are incredibly well policed and turned back at the border of California. So I just wonder if you've thought about the railroad.
Laura, it's a very interesting question. And it certainly makes great sense to me that Southerners who are having trouble losing human property at sea would want a more policeable form of transport. But I haven't studied that. It does strike me as not only plausible, but likely. Now, there are ways to evade the policing of railroads too, as the hobos used to prove.
Mm.
I mean, that's a much later period, but the use of railroads for illicit travel is very significant. But it would be, I mean, I do know that, for example, investors in places like Charleston are keen to have railroad connections to other places. But I have not done the research to be able to comment on that with any specificity. But I want to encourage you to look into it, to continue to look into it, because I think you might be onto something really interesting there.
Thank you. Well, it's just to put it up against the sea, which you have evoked so much, and to question why. So the invisibilization of this large population, machine, and structure maybe comes about in part because of the visibilization of the railroads. That's really what I'm suggesting, because your question was, why is this so invisible?
Well, okay, I would just add 2 points to that. First of all, the ship is probably the deep sea sailing ship is probably the most important machine in the history of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
Right up there with the steam engine, because that ship, that's a technology, right? That ship is a technology. That is what allows Europe to establish this asymmetrical relationship with the rest of the world. That is an engine of conquest.
Mm.
So that is so I want to see the ship as a technology too. And that, of course, the battle with the railroad is very important. But it's a battle that it takes the railroads a long time to win, right? But then that comes back. See, one reason why we call it the Underground Railroad is because the railroad plays a massive part in American industrialization in a later time period. It's a symbol of industrialization. So I think that's another reason why retrospectively, as people in the late 19th century looked back on slavery, they reached for that railroad metaphor. But at the time, wasn't nearly as important as ships. But I do like your suggestion of putting those two in a dynamic relationship to each other and studying them in tandem. I think that's a good idea.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that I don't see any additional question, but I would like to ask. I have several questions, but we don't have time for that. One of the questions, because of the images that you showed and the images then that the book has, the images that Marcus showed during his presentation, then several of them are in the book in color. And I know that Marcus then works and has an important collection of Asian paintings as well. Then images are important for you. So I would like to ask two questions. The first one is that one of the images represented in this market woman, and would like to know about women a little bit more, about what role they played in these networks of people who escaped through the sea. The book focuses much more than on the 19th century, but during your presentation and in the book, then you say that this kind of escapes can be extrapolated to a larger period of time. And of course, here we are looking at the coastal areas of the United States, mainly then the Atlantic North. But I am sure that what is beautiful in this work is that it's the kind of work that can be expanded then to other parts of the Atlantic, and even covering Atlantic Africa as well. So about the women first, and second, about the role of images.
Okay, let me talk about the women first,
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then you'll ask your second question. I've mentioned the role of market women, who are really, should we say, workers on the front line of the struggle. That is really important. It's hard to get a lot of information about them. We know they're there, And I mentioned in the book that Robert Purvis, the Black abolitionist, founder of the Vigilance Committee in Philadelphia, credited two market women, one black and one white, as being the most effective people he ever worked with, who in sending people north to freedom with forged documents, seamen's protection certificates. But there's another theme in all this for women that I would really like to emphasize. In the free black communities, which would receive fugitives before they get on board the ship, women play an outsized role in protecting them, in feeding them, in hiding them. It's almost like an extension of the reproductive labors of the household. And this is especially important in a place like Norfolk. In Norfolk, women help to hide escapees. Some of these women were known to be, I don't call them conductors on the Underground Railroad, I call them pilots in the overseas freeway. They could hide these people for months at a time. That's an extraordinary feat, given the fact that people are looking for them. And so again, that speaks to the issue of the autonomy of these free black communities. So on both the escape side, on the passage side, when people were actually getting aboard the ships and getting off the ships, very important. I was also very keen to figure out if women escaped in smaller percentages on the waterfront than they did by land, because we think of the waterfront as a kind of hyper-masculine workspace. Women actually escaped in slightly higher numbers that way. My figures showed about 23%, whereas if you look at landed runaways, they were about 20% female. That number grew in the 1850s when some ship captains pursued abolitionist agendas by going south with the explicit idea of bringing people to freedom, and women and their families could be part of those arrangements. So the way in which escape by sea evolved over time expanded the role of women and their likelihood of getting away for free. So that's okay. Now about images.
So images, then I would like to know, because one of the interesting things that you did in the presentation is with this image of New York's Hudson River docks. And so you describe what is going on in that image, and bringing us to imagine how things look like at the time. What role images they play in your writing and the way you do research? Then they are not here illustrating only your work. It seems that when you write, you are taking inspiration from images to understand what to imagine this past, so historical past. I would like to know about that.
Well, it's a good question. I'm not sure anybody has ever asked that question to me, but I will tell you the first thing that I almost went into art history. I was very, very interested in the history of art, the social history of art, but I decided that I had better go into history in order to do the history of working people, to do history from below. But images have always been very important to me. And I'll tell you one thing that I've done in all my books. I've tried to select images such that if someone walks up in a bookstore and picks up a book of mine off the shelf and just looks at the images, that they can get the argument of the book.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I select images that epitomize something, that somehow, and then I select them and arrange them in a way so as to tell through the images a story. I consider paintings, engravings, drawings, I consider these to be absolutely crucial historical facts to be interrogated. In fact, I think my next book may be about maybe art history from below. We'll have to see about that.
Yes.
But I think the images are really crucial. They can tell you things that other kinds of sources can't tell you. They can tell you about spatial relationships. They can tell you about human relationships. So it's absolutely true. I do work with images, and some people have said that my writing is also imagistic, that I try to create an image of a person or a setting. I do that somewhat more consciously now than I used to. And I think that was shaped by my experience of writing a play, in which you have to be very conscious of evoking the drama. But of course, drama is what drives history forward. And there are many different kinds of drama. So that is, yeah, you're absolutely right. Images are crucial to me. You may see things in my uses of that I don't see, but I can tell you that they have mattered to me my entire life. The images that are in my books are really important parts of each and every book.
Yeah, this is wonderful, and wonderful coming from a historian. Of course, I see some of the comments you make, but I think that perhaps many people they don't know that, and it would be wonderful to have history of art from below. We have some comments. We don't have more questions, but we have some comments in the chat. Then we have Alessandra Cummings saying then here that it might be useful to look at Jacqueline Bishop's detailed study of the market woman, particularly through visual images over centuries. Then she just recently exhibited her series, The Keeper of All Secrets, at Queen's House Museum in the UK. And she's working now with Victoria Lane, the curator there, on a more expansive exhibition on that theme. Dale Colston, she's saying, Dr. Rediker, thank you for recognizing the variety of skills required and genius of those who committed wholeheartedly to self-emancipation. Thank you for sharing your life's work. So we have then this words that the different attendants are leaving to us. But most of all, I think that me and Alex, we want to thank you for this book, and especially also thank you for joining us today. This conversation remains on YouTube. And for those of you who didn't get the book, then the book is Freedom Ship, and the book that was just published now in May 2025 and is with Viking United States. So, and it's a book that you are going to enjoy and richly illustrated as well. And I think that Marcus' presentation today gave a nice overview, but also teasing a lot of points that will encourage us to continue discussing this theme and the book itself. After this, I just want then to thank Marcus again and to invite you for our next book club. Then we still have this year 2 sessions, one coming on March 25th, October 25th, and this is a Saturday, and this is with Toby Green. I don't have the edition that there is this UK edition. Alex has the Chicago edition. Then the book is The Heretic of Cashel, Struggles Over Life in a 17th Century West African Port. And Toby will be here with us on Saturday, October 25th at 2 p.m. As well, 2 p.m. EST. So I hope that you come, and then you have a last session on November the 15th with Roquinaldo Ferreira, with his latest book. So again, thank you everyone for joining us, and especially thank you, Marcus, and hope you have more occasions to see Marcus talking about the book as well. Thank you, Marcus.
My pleasure. And let me say, Alex, I'm down with this idea of an amphibious turn. Let's do it.
Oh, you saw that in the
yeah.
chat.
Thanks to you both very warmly. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
I
much,
would like to
Marcus.
thank
You know, the funny thing is that when I
organizers.
asked you the Julius Scott question, I have forgotten that you wrote the preface.
Right.
I got now I remember, and I remember the preface after and when you responded.
Check out the event on the Common Wind on YouTube.
I will do. Will
Peter
do.
and Robin were on fire that day.
Will do. Thank you so much. Thank you so much
Okay,
for joining
my
us, and thank
pleasure.
you, everybody. So
Thank
lovely
you.
to see so many friendly
Thank you all.
faces as always.
Organizers, please.
Thank,
And Anna, you for everything you do.
thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you for
Thank you,
coming.
Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye, everybody. Have a
Bye-bye.
good weekend.
Ciao, queridos.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Okay, I think that you can. Let me
We
just...
wait for